one of the factors is that Harvard fought tooth and nail to fight discovery. It's like, oh, this is our trade secret. This is our secret sauce, how we admit people. And ultimately, they were able to keep some of their processes still secret, but a lot of it did come to light through discovery.
I think most people are just familiar with the fact that affirmative action has been taken back. Can you kind of offer some bigger information or more detailed information? Like, what was this case about? What made the plaintiffs even go down this road?
Essentially, this case was organized by a guy named Edward Blum. And he is a conservative legal activist from a Jewish background, actually. And I understand that his activism was apparently informed by his experiences with both anti-Semitism, and also he ran for Congress when there was a Democratic nominee that was unopposed. He ran for Congress in a heavily gerrymandered district, and that also struck him very powerfully as unfair. And he has been involved in several Supreme Court cases over the course of his lifetime, one including that issue of gerrymandering, and a number of them he has actually won. So
what's gerrymandering? I think I know what it is, but that might be a new word for some people.
Sure. Gerrymandering is when they're drawing the congressional districts, and some of them are in this really weird shape, serpentine-like districts. And the purpose of the district was not to reflect geographical reality. It was to try to engineer a certain result in the vote, and based on the demographics and population of the people in that district or in that heavily contorted district. So that's what gerrymandering is. And there are elements, I mean, it basically continues to this day, and there are large parts of it that are allowed and considered lawful, except for some of the more extreme versions. And, that's why there are very few actually competitive congressional elections in every 2 years. Very few of them are actually competitive. And that's one of the reasons, is the design of your voting district in this fashion.
So this Jewish attorney has kind of an interest in taking on or looking for cases that somehow demonstrate ethnic partiality. Is that the connection between his advocacy against gerrymandering and this case?
Yeah, I mean, again, he has pursued a number of cases along that line, that, relating to ethnic partiality or just fairness in the way that he is perceiving them. And it's interesting because this man, Edward Blum, he and his supposed motives have been pretty savagely demonized by a lot of the left. I honestly don't know a ton about him, but I will say that in America, citizens are allowed to pursue justice in court, and their own personal beliefs and even ideology may indeed inform their actions. So the reality here is that Edward Blum and his organization and its Asian members, also known as Students for Fair Admissions, they properly brought a lawsuit. They persevered through losses at 2 district courts and 1 circuit court, and eventually they did prevail at the Supreme Court.
So tell us a little bit about, what the case was, and what prompted the case and where they felt like the injustice was happening.
Yeah, what was Blum seeing?
Yeah, well, what may have prompted them and why they thought discrimination was in play even in these admissions processes, really, I'll tell you from personal experience, I know that it has been conventional wisdom in the Asian community since even I applied for college in the late 80s, that being Asian was not a benefit to your chances of being accepted to any university. And that view certainly hardened in the 90s and throughout the 21st century. And the anecdotal and actual data appeared to bear those concerns out. And so when they sued, that was, I believe, what motivated the case, this notion that Asians were not getting a fair deal. And then when they sued during the discovery process, in particular with Harvard, they obtained a ton of confirming information to that effect, including even the fact that Harvard had commissioned their own internal investigation in 2013, which showed that Asians were being unfairly treated, and yet they just ignored and buried the report, which is just utterly offensive to biblical justice.
What we generally hear is like the stereotypical Asian, or like the smart Asian and things like that, which definitely don't fall, for every Asian person. But why would university admissions be seen as something that works against Asian students in particular? Because you mentioned that there was something, if I get the gist of it, that there was something that would be working against Asian students, that it wasn't in your favor. But what would that be, and why would it be that?
So the interesting dynamic here is that Asians, in terms of a percentage of the population in America, maybe 6 or 7%, but in terms of a lot of college classes, they may be at Harvard, for example, around 20%. So Asians are overrepresented relative to their proportion of the population, but they're actually underrepresented when considering the percentage of applicants, and also arguably, I think pretty strongly arguably, according to their credentials academically. So, I think that one example is that when California banned affirmative action in the state a couple of decades ago, the percentage of Asians shot up at some schools north of 50% in terms of the population, even though Asians represented a smaller percentage of the population. But when you looked at certain academic credentials, test scores, grades, again, the rate in the terms of the number of applications, that was a much more fair representation when you considered all of the criteria that go into the admissions. So I think that's one of the confusing things. People think, oh, there's a ton of Asians at colleges. Why are they upset? And the answer is, when you tease out the numbers, they did a number of studies with respect to SAT scores, which, by the way, are now being phased out by a lot of colleges. I'll get to that at another time, perhaps. But, the SAT scores, being Asian, you would have to get a certain level SAT score to obtain admission as an average Asian person. And that would be a number that was like 30 or 40 points higher than the average white applicant, and then a little bit less than 200 points higher than the average Latino applicant, and over 200 points higher than the average Black applicant. So when you compare the numbers of situations like that, and even if you grant that it's not all about your SAT scores, that type of data that has been available for some time in various contexts really gave a clear indication that, hey, there are some unequal weights and measures being applied here, to use a biblical term from the Proverbs.
Yeah, definitely. I actually read an article, and I'm not sure which school it was. I thought it was Harvard, but must have been a different school, where it was like upwards of 100 points higher for Asian students as opposed to like a Black student or a white student.
Yeah,
and so definitely.
Yep. So that would be an example of the situation that a lot of these applicants, were trying to combat.
So I guess I'm sort of naive here. My kids weren't applying to Ivy League schools. Isn't there just some kind of across the board rubric where all the students are evaluated the same, or is part of this case that you're saying that there's different evaluations based on race? This is a little confusing to me.
Yeah, and I understand your confusion, because it's a very arcane and at times very non-transparent process. And really, that's the danger. I would say that I'm a big believer in transparency, right? And I think that you look at John 3:19-21 would say, and this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people love the darkness rather than the light, because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his works should be exposed. But whoever does what is true comes to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out in God. And one of the factors is that Harvard fought tooth and nail to fight discovery. It's like, oh, this is our trade secret. This is our secret sauce, how we admit people. And ultimately, they were able to keep some of their processes still secret, but a lot of it did come to light through discovery. And a lot of this became clear, including that 2013 internal report that I had mentioned that Harvard had investigated that had shown unfairness to Asians. So the reason, if you look throughout the history of law, a lot of times, the more the decision maker has absolute discretion and subjective discretion to make a decision, the greater the danger is that decision is going to be improper in some way. It's going to be influenced potentially by nepotism, or by financial corruption, or by, in these cases, race, which, according to the line of cases in the Supreme Court, there's only certain very limited ways you were able to consider race in the past, and even now going forward. So when Harvard is having this very secret process, and throughout this process, it just blows me away. There was this element called the personal rating. And on that element, Asian applicants were like way lower rated than any white, Latino, or Black applicant on the personal rating. And these are ratings that would attempt to assess matters of character, matters of, is this person an effective leader? Is this person, just like an attractional person to be around others? And even though the vast majority of cases, the admissions officer had never even met the vast majority of the applicants, the Asian personal readings were like way lower, just on very often arbitrary seeming criteria. So whenever you add that subjective element, they did the same thing Harvard did, by the way, in the 20s and 30s and beyond, really, with Jewish applicants. And there was, at the time, there was this notion of the Jewish quota where you could never have more than a certain percent of Jewish students at Harvard. And a lot of times it was, again, this type of notion of character, supposed character, where a lot of these Jewish applicants were discriminated against. And again, it's this subjective assessment that can often be a cloak for improper forms of judgment.